Hello, and welcome to our workshop. This workshop was previously delivered by SMU's Academic Learning Services Writing Center. As a result, you may hear references to other workshops, be prompted to take part in group activities, or hear references to the active chat from the original delivery of this session. As you follow along, feel free to pause the video and participate in exercises and activities as best you can. We hope you enjoy the workshop.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, science folks. This is fun. My background, just so you know before we get into this, my undergrad degree was in marine and freshwater biology. So I have a biology background because I love the oceans so much. And I have a master's degree that I did at Dalhousie here in Halifax in computational biology and bioinformatics. So with that focus, it's technically a computer science master's degree, with a focus, of course, on methodology, and I was researching population genetics of Atlantic salmon for fisheries management. So just to give you a bit of an idea of where I come from, what my experience is like, people sometimes think about science as not really being writing heavy, because we think of writing as like essays and books, but boy, is that not true. There is a lot of writing in science, and it can be really hard in its own way. So that's my background. I'm interested to know what everyone is interested in, what you're all taking, what programs you're in. But here we go, I'm gonna get going. So scientific writing across disciplines, regardless of whether you're in astrophysics or engineering or biology, scientific writing follows a consistent format. There is some nuance within fields, but in general, this approach I'm gonna write before, this applies pretty consistently, and this is the main format that you'll be learning about in your education career. Scientific writing is a systematic method of writing that is direct, clear, and concise. That is the main goal. That's the priority. There is very little flowery, fluttery language. Hopefully later on, if you do an honors or master's thesis in graduate writing, that stuff all gets cut out. It's beautiful, but it's not for science. Scientific writing is formal and generally passive in tone. We're going to talk a little bit more about what this means throughout the session, but the reason for this is because the focus of science is on the information that is being gained, and it's very objective, or the goal is to be objective, right? And so because it's objective, the scientists, the people who are doing the research, is not what's important in science. The research that's being done is what's important, and so that is the focus of the writing, and that's what we mean by passive. This systematic method allows readers to find the information they are looking for efficiently. So kind of like in Amanda's reading to write approach, where we had these different sections, scientific writing is even more sectioned, so that I don't necessarily need to read a whole article if I just want to know the statistical approach that and the results that this paper used. I just want to dig right into that. Maybe I've done a ton of research and I already know the background about salmon. I know enough about salmon genetics in my case that I'm not going to read another introduction right now. I just need to get at the methodology because that was my computer science approach. Scientific writing is such that that is possible. I know exactly where I can find this. There's a lot of general sections that are consistent, and there's also a lot of subheadings that are used to help us find that information. And this method presents only the information pertinent to the findings and implications. So we talked about providing all that context in an introduction for general essay writing in the last session, and that is exactly true in scientific writing, where we only want to include the context that is relevant to the research at hand. Okay, so we're going to take a look at an example scientific article. It's found on Brightspace, but I'm just going to upload it here so that's available for everyone. And this is an example of a scientific article. Open that up and let me know, feel free to write in the chat or turn your mic on, what is the first thing that you see at the top of the very first page? Marine biology and ecology. Okay, so what we have right there is the journal name. We have the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology. So in case you don't know, to give you a bit of an idea of how scientific publication works, we have labs of researchers, usually run by a lead researcher who's generally your professor. Sometimes you'll have instructors that are in different roles as well, and they run a lab. They have a ship that's full of employed researchers, that's full of graduate students, that's full of undergraduate researchers and volunteers, and they kind of coordinate and manage this whole group in the process of knowledge acquisition through experimentation or testing, whether it's actual like hands-on experiments. Not necessarily. Now, there's also a lot of collaboration between different labs. Sometimes it's not within a university institution, but within a government institution. So I used to work for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans here in Canada, and there I was a part of a lab group that was funded by the government. It was actually a part of a government department. Once that research is done, we write these papers in the format that we're going to look at today, and we submit them to a journal. And journals can be widely encompassing, like the journal Science, which is huge and really difficult to get into, or you can get very, very specific, like the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences, for example. Here we have the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology. So sometimes it's really helpful if you know the kind of research you're looking for to look within a journal, but not necessarily, but it's still good just to get an idea right off the bat of what the container is that you'll find your paper in. So journals are often published monthly, sometimes every other month, and there's a particular structure that a journal has for their writing as well. Next up, we see the article title. And here it is, Never Forget Where You Came From, Microhabitat of Origin Influences Boldness and Exploration in the Hermit Crab. And then we have the Latin name, genus and species, and the family in brackets. So that's the way that we generally talk about species. We have their common name, their Latin name. In this title, we actually know the findings of this research right off the bat. We know that the researchers found a relationship between microhabitat of origin and later behavior of boldness and exploration in hermit crabs. Cool, so we kind of know what the research is, we know what the topic is, we actually even know some of the findings. And we had a fun little title, Never Forget Where You Came From, where sometimes we see that in science as well. Next up, we see authors and affiliations. You'll notice that there are often a lot of authors. Sometimes this is within a lab group like I described. Sometimes it's between lab groups. One thing that's really interesting to know here, generally the first author in a scientific paper is the person who did the majority of the actual writing and the organization of the research sometimes. The very last author generally, that's the person who runs the ship. So while you're going through the process of looking for research, if you find an article that is exactly what you need and a good support for the kind of work that you're doing, sometimes looking at the body of research that's been done by the author who is listed last can be really helpful. So you can search by author name as well. We talked in the first couple of days of how to be an online student about doing that research, and looking by author name when you have that lab head or professor position, sometimes that can be helpful to see the other kind of research that they're doing and finding other evidence and other research that's applicable to what you're looking for. Okay, next up we have keywords. Keywords are also really helpful as far as informing your research searching process. Sometimes you might put in a topic or a word like hermit crab behavior and get tons and tons of stuff, and you really want to narrow down on that. And so also looking at the keywords that an article uses can help to inform what you're going to search moving forward, to make sure that you get and hone in on that research that you're looking for. Once we have the keyword done, we have the abstract. It is a summary of the research. It's not just a preamble, it's not a teaser. It provides everything. You have the introduction of the topic, it tells you exactly what was done, it tells you the results, and it tells you what they think of those results, all within the whole thing. So all of the information is contained within an abstract. So now that we have that first page covered, let's look at the body of the paper. How is the paper structured? So I'd like you to take a look at that and write in the chat. You'll find some numbered headings as you scroll through that paper, and let me know what they are. What is the overall structure that you see? Great. So we have the introduction, we have materials and methods, we have the results, and we have the discussion. Now, you also mentioned funding and references, which we're not going to talk about too much here. References we'll talk about in the citation station session. Funding is also good to note because that gives you an idea of bias, which I know we talked about with Lauren this morning. Knowing where the money comes from to support some research can give you a good idea into how that might have influenced their interpretation of their findings. Ideally, it hasn't, but sometimes it can. And so that's why researchers always need to state their funding and where it came from so that readers can have a critical lens on their understanding. So the main headings of the main meat of the paper itself are introduction, materials, methods, results, and discussion. And this is known as the IMRAD format. I hate that the A for and has a letter itself, but it does. We just have to accept it because that's what people call it. Throughout your scientific education, you'll be writing lab reports that mimic this format. It's to prepare you for comprehension and communication in the sciences, because this is how things are done professionally. This is how science is communicated at its primary basic level. And whether or not you go into doing research yourself or whether you go into some other kind of aspect of science, it's always important to be able to break down this kind of information and understand where it's coming from, be able to analyze it and know what it's talking about in depth, and ultimately be able to communicate it, even if you're not writing these papers yourself in your career, be able to communicate. Maybe you get a job in like scientific communication for the average person, because a lot of people who don't have a background in science have no idea how to digest these kind of papers or this kind of dense, very direct, efficient way of writing. And so it's important as someone with a scientific background to know what it is what this format means. So we're going to take a look at each of these sections. I'm going to put you into breakout groups. In group 1, I would like you just to take a look at the introduction and get an idea of the type of information, not necessarily the details of the study, so you don't need to tell me anything about hermit crabs or their behavior, but just like the general type of information that you see in your section. Group 2, I'd like you to look at the materials and methods section. For that section in particular, don't get too caught up on the statistics and what's actually going on. Again, don't worry about the details, but the type of information that you see. I guess. Group 3, I'd like you to take a look at the results section. And group 4, I'd like you to take a look at the discussion section. So let's talk about each of these sections. Could I have a reporter from group 1 let me know what it is that you found? What was the general types of information that you saw in that introduction?
What we saw from the introduction was that they were pretty much just telling about what they were going to investigate. We didn't really get too far into it, so that's all I really noticed.
Cool, that's fair, yeah. So in the introduction, we have the background information, that context, like in a general introduction that we talked about in the last session, and the purpose of this, what it is that they're going to investigate. So often at the very end of an introduction, in the last little paragraph, kind of like how we discussed, you have a thesis statement with an explanation. Oftentimes at the very end of an introduction, you'll see the hypothesis and the prediction of what the researchers are actually going to get. What is their research question, but generally not necessarily phrased as a question, and what they expect the outcome to be of their experiment given the background information that they have and what that will help them learn about. You can kind of think of like the prediction of an experiment as being akin to the thesis statement. Also, the introduction, you'll notice, was written in present tense. So we'll talk a little bit about how the different sections are written. So you'll notice it's in present tense, and that's because you're talking about current phenomenon, right? We're talking about phenomena, I should say. We're talking about things that exist, things that we know in the present moment. And so we're speaking presently. Okay, what about the materials and methods section? Could someone from group 2 speak to the kind of stuff that they saw in there?
Well, first I noticed that it was written in past tense. So everything that they did not leave out any details. So they informed us about everything on anything that could affect the study, like the temperature, the soil, what gender of animals that they collected, age group, the water, the temperature, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that phrase that you said, anything that could affect the study, is exactly the kind of phrase that I've used before. So the level of detail that's included in the materials and methods section is anything that could impact the outcomes, right? Ultimately, they're talking about what was done, right? So anyone who's reading this needs to be able to replicate the experiment exactly. And so that's why all those details are given. Or if they can't replicate it exactly, they need to know what was different as a potential explanation for why their findings might be different from what the present researchers' findings are. And it's in past tense, and it's often in passive voice. So this particular paper isn't written in passive voice very much. And you can tell that because they start a lot of their sentences with we. So we did this, we did that. And that's active voice because the subject of the sentence is the person who's doing it. Passive voice, conversely, has the subject, what is being done. So I have an example here from the materials and methods section where a sentence said, therefore, muddy with roots was considered the most protected substrate from predators. And so that is written in passive voice. Biology generally is less focused on the passive voice. They're a bit more okay with using pronouns in their writing, but not all fields are the case for that. But your professors will also let you know how much they care about passive or active voice as you write your materials and methods sections for classes. Okay, results. Could someone from group 3 let me know the kind of stuff that they saw?
Okay, hi. So we didn't get too far into results, but basically the general, like what we could take from it, there was I think there was like a little blurb at the start, just kind of vocalizing what they had found, and then a whole bunch of charts, graphs that illustrated like what they were saying they found in the results.
All of the figures and tables, where regardless of where they're placed within the paper itself, within like the layout, all tables and figures are technically a part of results.
Yeah.
So you'll have some professors who will tell you to integrate them within the results of the section you're writing. Sometimes, and generally when you get to the publication stage of research, they're written as like a section in and of themselves. But you can tell that because within the section of the results text, all those references, right, you'll see like see table 1 or figure 2 in brackets, all the references to tables and figures are within the results themselves. Results, you say overall observations, outcome of the data analysis. So I didn't mention this, but in materials and methods, we always state the kind of statistical approach that was done and how it was done, because that's another aspect of the research of the experiment is how you analyze the data. But then the outcome of that is in the results, as well as figures and tables. And it was also written in past tense and also generally passive voice, because it's what was found. It's a past tense thing.
And in the discussion, we saw that basically whatever the results were, they were being explained throughout the discussion piece. So explaining why you saw what you saw. Then we saw that there was a use of supporting material or articles to add more support to what was found in the results. And as you would have mentioned in the results, sometimes they show more results in the discussion. We saw a lot of that where references were made to certain tables and to certain graphs to support the material that was being discussed.
Perfect. That's a awesome answer. So the first thing you mentioned was that explanation of the results. So I have it here, the interpretation of the results, but that's exactly right. So all of the results are stated then, but anything, as soon as you're making a conclusion from the results, as soon as you're saying something about them, now we're talking about the discussion section. It also places the study information into context, and that's what you said, Dulissa, about providing supporting information. So I mentioned in the last session, for those of you who were in the pre-writing session, that I kind of think of the conclusion as like placing this work, this knowledge that you've acquired, that you've developed, that in the conclusion, you're placing that into the context of the overall field. And the discussion is the same thing. So now we're talking about the field in general. It's like, okay, this is what we knew before. Now that we've done this research, what can we say moving forward? So also, generally discussion will also have any like future kind of research plans as well, things that will help inform future work. And in general, this is also written in present tense. That is because, again, like the introduction, we're talking about things that exist currently. So we're going out of the specific research that was done, speaking about that, but the discussion goes back and forth a little bit because you do still talk about the results, but placing it into context of the current field, we're getting back into present tense and present phenomena. So what I would like you to do is choose a simple activity that you do in your house. And I am going to say really simple because you noticed when we were talking about the materials and methods that a lot of details are required. So what I'd like you to do is to write the process of how you do this activity, or you notice I've written in past and passive voice, how this activity was done in the format of a materials and methods section. So that means past tense and passive voice. It needs to be replicable, so anyone who reads this materials and methods section could do something exactly as you do it. And it's also incomplete sentences. So it's not like a recipe book. It's not listed in point form. It's listed as a paragraph style. So choose something very simple, something like washing dishes, how you might clean the table after dinner, cleaning a window, anything like that. So just a very simple action-based activity that's done in your house. Take a few minutes to write that out. Okay, so here I have exercise 2B. It's okay if you didn't get your whole exercise, your activity finished. We're going to review these sections. The individual walked to the refrigerator and opened it. After retrieving a box, the individual went to a cabinet to retrieve the glass. Having placed the glass onto the countertop, the individual tilted the box until liquid flowed from within, stopping once the glass was approximately 3/4 full. Okay, so as we read that, or as you heard me say that, imagine doing that action yourself. And are there any details that are unclear or missing? Anything someone can notice that might be difficult to replicate this activity? I think it's a pretty good level of detail. What I might comment on is how big the glass was. You mentioned that it was in a cabinet, so that might give me an idea of the glass. This is kind of a good one because pouring a glass of juice is similar to like maybe pouring a reagent in a chemical reaction and some kind of lab approach. And so, of course, the amount of reagent that you use matters. So you did say it's 3/4 full, but you might want to say like a pint glass or a 500 milliliter glass, something like that. And then we have a better idea that you're not filling up like a whole pitcher. As far as the passive voice, so you didn't say I or we, but using the individual as the subject is still technically writing in active voice because the person is still the subject. So to switch that around, an example would be like after retrieving the box, and then instead of saying the individual went to a cabinet to retrieve a glass, you could say after retrieving a box, a glass was retrieved from the cabinet. Does that make sense how I switch that around? So what we do is we make the subject either the object that the experiment is being done with or the action itself. And then same thing with that second example. So the individual tilted the box until liquid flowed from within. So we could say the box was tilted until liquid flowed from within, stopping once the glass was approximately 3/4 full. Fine. And like that's very nitpicky, but that's just like a good practice in how we can switch into that passive voice. Yeah, great work though. I feel like that's definitely replicable. Does anybody else want to share their activity that they wrote? Another thing that you'll see potentially like talking about cereal and milk, was it 2% or 1%? What was the cereal? Whenever you write about like a device that's used, so say you're weighing with a scale, oftentimes it's required, almost always actually in science, it's required to state the make and the manufacturer of every object that you use. I need to say the company that made the scale, the number of digits, whether it's in the 10th or 100th decimal place of the reading, where it was manufactured, that information all needs to go in there too. And so that's something that we might be able to think of with like cereal and spoons. Writing in the sciences, it's a very particular focused way of writing and it takes a long time to learn, but you have the whole of your scientific career to learn about that, right? You don't have to have it all right off the bat. Just being in the session and being introduced to it is a great head start. You're well on your way. And also don't forget that the Writing Center is here for your whole educational degree, and that includes for scientific writing. So in particular, I recommend seeing either myself or Amanda because we have more of the experience with scientific writing if you ever need help throughout your education. Thanks for being a part of this session, and I hope to see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.